In the early 1530s, Münster stood as a successful Westphalian city, busy with trade and proud of its independence. But the confidence of everyday life carried a crack underneath. Across Europe, the Reformation had already shaken old loyalties, and Münster felt it too. Many citizens had grown wary of Catholic authority, especially the power of church courts, taxes, and distant bishops. Trust weakened, doubt spread, and when trust collapsed, new voices found room to enter. Those voices arrived through sermons, travelling preachers, and cheap printed pamphlets that moved faster than any official decree. They carried a sharper message than ordinary reform. They argued that the church had to be rebuilt from the ground up, clean, disciplined, and based on true belief rather than inherited tradition. They rejected the idea that faith came automatically through birth and ritual. Instead, they insisted it had to be chosen. That single idea turned religion into a personal test and a public dividing line. These Anabaptist ideas did not spread as a quiet theory. They carried a promise. A purified church and a godly community that would finally match the words of Scripture. For people tired of compromise, it sounded like certainty. For the city's Catholic leadership, it sounded like danger. Each pamphlet, each sermon, each whispered argument widened the gap between neighbours who had once worshipped together. Münster still looked stable from the outside. Inside, belief started to reorganize loyalty, and loyalty started to shift. The arguments in Münster stopped being private, sermons grew sharper, and public debates pulled in ordinary people who wanted certainty in a time of change. More citizens accepted Anabaptist teaching and said so openly, not just in whispers. That changed daily life fast. Neighbours started sorting themselves into sides. The old religious balance tilted, and city leaders could no longer pretend it stayed a fringe movement. As the numbers grew, influence followed. Anabaptist preachers and their allies stopped acting like outsiders and started acting like a bloc. Supporters coordinated their votes and backed candidates who promised protection for the new faith. Small decisions mattered: who got a voice in meetings, who handled records, who controlled money, who kept order. Step by step, sympathizers took seats and posts that turned belief into leverage. Now the shift became measurable. The city's civic institutions, built to manage trade and law, began reflecting this new majority. Officials who resisted faced pressure, isolation, and the risk of being replaced. Officials who cooperated found themselves rewarded with support in the streets. The result looked simple, but carried a heavy consequence. Münster no longer just contained an Anabaptist movement. It started giving that movement power. As the movement grew, its goals shifted. Reform no longer seemed enough. The radicals treated the city like a community under inspection, and they decided who counted as truly faithful. The key tool was rebaptism. Adults were baptized again as a public break from the old church. It sounded spiritual, but it worked like a test. Refuse it, and you stood out. Stand out, and pressure followed. That pressure came in clear, practical ways. Meetings were disrupted. Critics were shouted down. Neighbours watched neighbours, and fear did the work of persuasion. Rebaptisms happened in large numbers, fast and in public, so the change looked unstoppable. Each new baptism felt like one more vote, one more body on the inside, and the line between faith and loyalty blurred. Belonging meant compliance, and compliance meant survival. Then the political balance tipped. City offices and councils no longer acted as neutral civic authority. They followed the new religious leaders and their supporters. Decisions that once belonged to the old order now moved through Anabaptist hands. Officials who resisted lost influence, fled, or were pushed aside. The takeover did not need a single dramatic coup to work. It advanced through control of who belonged until Münster's government effectively became Anabaptist. Outside Münster, the people pushed out of power did not simply accept defeat. They regrouped, appealed to allies, and described the city as a contagion that had to be contained. Over them stood the Prince-Bishop, Franz von Waldeck, both a church leader and a territorial ruler who saw Münster slipping from his control. He treated the takeover as rebellion wrapped in heresy. That combination demanded force, not negotiation. The Prince-Bishop rallied nobles and neighbouring towns, arguing that Münster had become a dangerous enclave, a place where religious disorder could spread across the region. He framed the fight as protection of the wider public, not just a personal struggle for authority. Then the response hardened into action. Armed men moved into position, roads were watched, gates were threatened, and messages in and out became risky. The siege began, and Münster's experiment met a wall of steel. Once the ring tightened, the city's choices narrowed fast. A community that had seized power in the name of faith now had to survive as an isolated fortress. Food and supplies became strategic problems, not private matters. Every decision started to run through the question of endurance. Who could be trusted? What could be spared? What rules could be enforced? Pressure from outside pushed control inward. Münster shifted from revolt to wartime theocracy because siege conditions rewarded discipline and punished doubt. With the siege pressing in, the rulers inside Münster stopped presenting themselves as one religious option among many. They declared the city the New Jerusalem, a place chosen by God and set apart from the corrupt world outside. That claim changed everything. If Münster had been selected by heaven, then ordinary disagreement became rebellion against God. The leaders used prophecy like a legal charter, and they began remaking daily life as sacred duty. The new order moved fast. Property stopped being private and became a resource for the holy community, gathered up and reassigned by those in charge. Hoarding counted as sin, and refusing to hand goods over counted as defiance. Conformity also became mandatory. People had to attend approved worship, follow approved teachings, and accept the new rules without argument. The point was control as much as belief. Faith became something that could be checked, measured, and enforced. And enforcement meant punishment. Dissenters faced harsh penalties that made examples out of them and warned everyone else to stay quiet. Old protections fell away because the regime treated opposition as a threat to the city's survival and to God's plan. Under siege, leaders claimed emergency powers, and those powers kept expanding. Münster did not just become stricter, it became coercive by design. Inside the walls, law and religion fused into one weapon. As the siege dragged on, food vanished and certainty cracked. Hunger did not just weaken bodies, it narrowed choices. In that pressure, the movement's leadership stopped feeling shared and started feeling owned. A small circle of charismatic men absorbed decision after decision, presenting their will as the only path left. The city's rules turned sharper. Obedience stopped being a virtue and became the price of staying alive. Fear did the rest. Leaders treated doubt as contamination, and they searched for it everywhere, among the exhausted, the grieving, and the simply hungry. Informing became a form of safety. Accusations became weapons. Each crisis fed a new test of loyalty, and each test concentrated more power at the top. The regime no longer relied on persuasion or shared belief. It relied on submission, measured in public acts that proved a person's place. Then terror became policy. Punishment moved out of back rooms and into open view because the point was not correction, it was instruction. Public executions marked the boundary of the pure community. showing what happened to anyone labelled disloyal or impure. The spectacle disciplined the crowd before a word was spoken. With starvation rising, the leaders used death to keep order, and with each execution, fear replaced faith as the system's strongest tool. As the siege dragged on, the leaders did not just tighten discipline, they rewrote daily life. Hunger and fear became proof that the end times had arrived, and every rule was recast as a test of faith. Then came a drastic shift. Polygamy was ordered, not suggested. It was presented as both practical survival and holy command, meant to reshape the city's future in one stroke. The new policy reached straight into households. Marriage stopped being a private bond and became a matter of obedience. Women were assigned or pressured into unions, and refusal carried consequences that could ruin a family overnight. Men who hesitated risked being branded disloyal. Children were pulled into the same net as leaders monitored homes for compliance and treated ordinary grief as rebellion against God's plan. The human cost rose fast. Some residents complied out of terror or desperation, trying to keep food, shelter, and protection. Others resisted quietly, clinging to older loyalties and resenting the state's reach into the most intimate parts of life. The policy did not create unity. It widened cracks already forming under starvation and violence, and it left people traumatized, divided, and more willing to risk defiance. As the siege dragged on, Münster's basic systems began to fail. Food ran out first, then the small reserves that had made the city feel secure. People weakened, work slowed, and discipline became harder to enforce without constant fear. Yet the leadership did not soften. Instead, every new shortage was treated as proof that the end of the world drew closer, and that suffering itself meant the city had been chosen. Prophecy stopped being just a belief and became a tool of rule. Predictions replaced planning. If a deadline passed and nothing changed, the explanation shifted and the demands increased. Leaders pushed for harsher obedience, claiming that doubt endangered everyone, not just the doubter. The siege outside tightened its grip, but inside, the movement turned inward, looking for betrayal, impurity, and weak faith to blame for collapse. Then the leadership took a final step that closed off every exit. They committed to an end-times stance that treated surrender as spiritual suicide and compromise as treason against God. This was not stubbornness alone. It was a decision that rewired reality. Any call to negotiate became proof of disloyalty. Any sign of military defeat became a test to be endured. Münster's fate became fixed, because retreat was no longer allowed to exist. In 1535, the siege finally ended the only way it still could, by force. The besieging army broke through Münster's defences and poured into the streets. What followed was not a clean surrender or a negotiated transfer of power. It was close fighting, house by house, with exhausted defenders pushed back step by step. The theocracy that had ruled by fear collapsed in the same language it had used, violence. When control returned to the attackers, the aftermath turned into punishment. Suspected supporters were hunted down, and reprisals followed fast. The new rulers did not treat Münster as a city simply reclaimed. They treated it as a crime scene that needed a lesson written into it. The movement's leaders were captured alive, kept for interrogation, and held as proof that the so-called New Jerusalem had been broken by ordinary soldiers. Then the victors staged the ending in public. The captured leaders were tortured and executed, not in private, but as a message. Their bodies were displayed so no one could pretend the experiment might rise again. Münster's name stopped meaning reform or prophecy and started meaning warning. Across Europe, authorities repeated the story. This was what happened when religious rule turned into force and when a city followed it to the end. After the fighting ended, the message did not. The punished leaders stayed on display, and the city's defeat became a public lesson, repeated for anyone tempted by revolt. Writers seized on Münster as proof that religious change led to chaos. Chronicles and official reports hardened into a single story. A city taken over by fanaticism, then crushed by rightful force. Memory became part of control long after the weapons fell silent. Over the centuries, that story got used again and again. Catholic and Protestant authorities pointed to Münster to discredit rivals, and the label of Anabaptist turned into a catch-all threat. Peaceful communities elsewhere got pushed into the shadow of the Münster image. The uprising became a shortcut in arguments, a warning word, and a tool for policing dissent. One local disaster ended up shaping how Europe talked about religious radicals. In modern Münster, the city carried on as a stable place that marked its past instead of reliving it. People visited the reminders and treated them as history, not a program. Yet the episode still worked as a case study with sharp edges. What happened when spiritual reform turned into rule by force, and when leaders demanded obedience at any cost? The contrast mattered. The early hope of peaceful change ended as a theocracy that fed on coercion.